Our world would be radically different if our society focused on the light triad instead of focusing on the dark triad. Let's find out why Paul Bloom is against empathy in this video.
I'm against empathy. I'm not against empathy for everything. I think empathy is a lot of fun when you're watching a movie, empathy for a fictional character. I think empathy is an important part of all sorts of exciting activities. But I'm against empathy as a moral guide. I think we could do better.
Against empathy as a moral guide? Seems like empathy and morals go hand in hand. Let's see what this dude has to say.
The sense of empathy I'm most interested in is when you, in a sense, put yourself in another person's shoes and feel what they feel. Psychologists call this emotional empathy. A lot of people think this is core to being a good person. A few years ago, I wrote a book called Against Empathy, The Case for Rational Compassion.
Emotional empathy is so important, especially since emotional intelligence and empathy are closely related. But a lot of people lack emotional intelligence and lack empathy because we focus on the dark triad in our culture, the triad of psychopaths and sociopaths.
And I argued that this form of empathy, though it might seem wonderful, is actually a very poor moral guide. Who do you feel empathy for? Who do you most naturally put yourself in the shoes of? Well, we know the answer to this from study after study after study. We naturally feel empathy for people who look like us, who speak our language, who we feel are safe. And because of that, empathy is, of all of the human feelings, perhaps the most biased and parochial.
When he frames it that way, it makes a lot of sense. I mean, we base our thoughts around the people we're around most often. And if you're around people that are like you, especially since we don't talk different languages, the Tower of Babel, as they say, separated us all and made these bunch of different languages, but that's just an allegory. There's so many different cultures around the world, there's no way you can relate to everybody empathetically. It's a lot about our emotions and how we present them in our native language. And if you grew up with a native language, you understand those emotions and how they're conveyed through facial expressions or body language. But if you didn't grow up in that culture, it's something you have to learn. And not everybody perceives these things the same way. So we definitely have a bias towards our own culture.
When you put a book out with the title Against Empathy, you got to expect a certain amount of blowback. And a lot of people responded to me with their own experiences and their own arguments. Sometimes people agreed with me. Sometimes they argued against me. So one argument against the purpose of my book is, although empathy could have negative effects, could be biased, could provoke us into violence, could cause all sorts of trouble, it also could have good effects. And I concede this in my book. And so some people have said, look, if you add it all up, the positive benefits of empathy outweigh the negative.
I would tend to agree with that. Even though there are positives and negatives to empathy, I would tend to agree that relying on empathy or focusing on empathy would gain a greater perspective and tend towards the good in most situations. Although it may not seem like it at the time, maybe we just have to take a wider perspective.
I'm not always convinced about that sort of math, but even if it were true, we have moral capacities that are better than empathy. Another objection is that empathy, whatever you think of its role when it comes to war and charity and broad moral decisions, is a necessary part of an intimate relationship. One philosopher, in a critique of me, said, if my wife comes in and she's mad at somebody at work, it's all well and good for me to say, I love you very much and I understand where you're coming from, but isn't what she wants me to share her anger, get angry with her? And my response to that is, it's kind of right. I don't deny that. There are cases where what we look for in a relationship with others is that sort of shared feeling. You're mad, you want me to be mad too. My critical response is, there's all sorts of cases where that's not what we want.
It's important to empathetically understand what the person wants from something. That's why I always ask the question of, are we listening or are we helping? When we're listening, we're just empathizing with what the person has to say and mostly agreeing with them because you love them, even if they're wrong sometimes. When you're trying to help them and that's what they choose to want, you can provide constructive criticism and feedback to the problem and try to find solutions. But there is a distinction between the two, and it's very important to know what the person wants at the time. they're presenting the information to you. And that's why it's better to communicate than to guess.
My favorite example here is anxiety. I go to my partner and I'm very anxious. I'm stressed out. Do I want her to start sharing my feeling of anxiety? To look at me and say, oh my God, it's horrible. Yeah, it's horrible. No, I want her to be calm. I want her to say, I love you. Calm down. Let me tell you how to think it differently. Sometimes what we want from people isn't a mirror of us. It's rather another intelligent, caring, loving person responding to us as a distinct being and working to make our life better. And I think sometimes empathy is exactly what we do not want.
This is very true, but again, it comes back to the communication of what they want in that time. Sometimes you can pick up that communication without actually asking the question based on previous experience and body language, but sometimes it's very important to ask because you can be wrong and it can be detrimental to what the person's desiring in that moment.
Now, if I'm going to say this, I have to come up with something that will replace empathy. I'm not saying we should give up on morality. So my book is called Against Empathy, but the subtitle of my book is The Case for Rational Compassion. And therein lies the substitute, I think. And the substitute has two parts. One is rationality. If I'm going to help somebody, I have to know what's the best way to help them. Sometimes what might seem to be the best way to help them simply makes things worse. Sometimes figuring out what to do to make the world a better place is an extraordinarily difficult task, too big for one brain. And we do our best when, as communities, we work together to think about that.
His rationale about rationality makes sense. We can help solve problems, but sometimes it takes a village to raise a child.
So that's rationality. Rationality itself is great at pursuing ends, but it doesn't provide ends, it doesn't provide goals. What you need is compassion. You need to care. So what I argue in the book is that our best decisions, our fairest, our most equitable ones, are done through a combination of a rational judgment of how does one make the world a better place, plus compassion, love, caring, but not the sort of love and caring that requires you put yourself in another person's shoes.
Without saying it, compassion is focusing on the light triad instead of the dark triad. Instead of sociopaths and psychopaths, we could focus on faith in humanity or trusting and believing in the goodness of human beings. Humanism or focusing on the well being and dignity of others. Or Kantianism, prioritizing ethical treatment and respect for others. If our world incentivized the light triad instead of the dark triad, we would be tending towards utopia. And utopia is a farce, but at the same time, we can tend towards that way instead of tending towards dystopia. The light triad focuses on empathy, altruism, and compassion, so there's space for all of it. I know that I choose to have hope for the future.
Even if empathy is on balance, has a positive effect, compassion does better. If we could reconfigure our moral attitudes to be less biased, less parochial, more with our head and less with our heart, we would do better.
Now, I don't fully agree with this. I think we need to meet in the middle. We need to use our head and our heart and meet in the middle to allow both of them to have their balanced point of view in the way that we perceive the world and the way that we move forward to change, be the change that we wish to see, be the change that all of our hearts and our heads know is possible. If you like this video, make sure to hit those like and subscribe buttons, and I'll see you in the next one.